Darwin himself was troubled by his own theory. It wasn't something he came up with. It's like, I'm going to prove to the world that creationism is wrong. And it wasn't something that he was out to be combative about. He wanted to understand how it all worked.
Hey, everybody. So I had a conversation with Rick Coste, the host of Evolution Talks, the podcast, and the author of Evolution Talks, the book. I read his book and it was fantastic and got to sit down and talk with him. I really enjoyed it. Unfortunately, I had audio issues again. So this makes 2 episodes now in the past few months. So I've had some audio issues and I need to get that figured out myself. It's on me. But I wanted to be able to share some of this conversation with you. So my goal here is I'm going to give a bit of a spiel about what I just said and asked, and I'll let you hear his responses. His audio came through pretty well. So that's the route I'm going to take here. I hope you enjoy the conversation, get to learn a little bit from him because I thought it was really cool, and hopefully this works. So we're going to start with Rick's origin story, so to speak, how he got into Evolution Talks, what made him want to create this product for the world, and we get to hear a bit about him, and we'll start there. I'll let him take it away.
Sure. So, yeah, the journey, and it actually started, years and years ago. I've always been interested in the topic of evolution. Like you, I probably read every book that's out there on evolution. Maybe dating back 20 years ago was when I really get into it. And this was before podcasting and everything. And it got to a point where it's like, I'm learning a lot. I want to do something with it. And I wasn't quite sure what to do with it at that point. I'm not a professor. I'm not, not an educator other than, my shows at, podcast is educational, as is the book and such. I like to think that I am I take complicated subjects and try to make them understandable for folks. And that's something I've always enjoyed doing. And I'm a writer too. But then podcasting came out, and funny enough is when it started, I was really into radio. Spacing out in the name now. It'll come to me. It doesn't matter. So there was one podcast I was always listening to, and I was always, very impressed with how they, did their research and how they would make any topic interesting by the use of music in the background, like a little bit of sound effects, things like that. It was a great podcast. It still is. That podcast still exists. But anyway, so around 2012. I thought, you know what, I'm gonna try this. I'm gonna see if I can, create my own podcast. And I did not do it on evolution. It was on philosophy. I had a podcast called Philosophy Walk it lasted a couple of years, but it's kind of how I learned the ropes on podcasting. I learned all about the audio, and I knew about, microphones and placement and audio software and editing, because I used to, fool around with guitars and everything. I've always been into music, as you can probably see behind me. I'm a big vinyl record guy. So setting up the audio piece of the podcasting was easy for me. And I also, when I was a child, I was very interested in old radio shows. I mean, they weren't around when I was a kid, but the records and the recordings and such, I just used to love listening to them. Those old, like the War of the Worlds, the Orson Welles in 1938 and The Shadow and all those old radio shows. So I brought some of that to podcasting with me, some of that interest. And with the Philosophy Walk podcast, I would pepper in, again, sound effects and some music and things just to make it a little bit more interesting, and also interesting for me instead of just talking into a mic. So that ran for a couple of years, but in the back of my head, I knew I wanted to do something with evolution. So I kind of put Philosophy Walk on hiatus, started the Evolution Talk podcast, and been doing that since I think 2014 is when I started Evolution Talk. So, and again, it was bringing everything I had learned up to that point, the sound effects, and I used voice artists, and that led to a whole another set of podcasts that I did in the late, around 2016 through 2019. I started writing, directing, casting audio dramas. So I have a few of those as well that are out there. Yeah, and they that was fun, and they did really well, and they're still in existence. They're all there. Um, there's a link to them all on my homepage. But yeah, I had a lot of fun with that. At one point, I was one of the shows I did was we had a cast across the world. Some of the cast was in England, some was in Canada, the U.S. It was that was a lot of fun, but it got to be expensive because I paid all the voice artists out of pocket. I didn't believe in not paying them for their work, so I think I did about 10 audio dramas, 10 or 11 series, short series. They were mini series, and then all the while I was doing Evolution Talk. I did put Evolution Talk on a brief hiatus while I was focusing on some of that work. Um, and then around 20, right before COVID, actually, I thought, I'm going to see if I can take everything I've learned with the podcasting about evolution, because that's one of the great things about doing the podcast is I don't know everything about evolution. If there's something I don't know, I learn about it and I put it into the show. So I learned a lot just doing the show. It
Right.
helped me learn, fill in some of the gaps in my knowledge. So I wrote a book, the Evolution Talk book, based on the podcast, and I was able to get an agent interested in it who found a publisher, and the book was published last October. So that's where we are today.
So Rick gets to tell us about his own background, the dramas he's written, actually, which is very cool, and how he's really just a learner. He's just a lifelong learner, and he really dives into the topics that interest him, and he does it in a very cool way. That's something that I admire. I think my dad would really admire. My dad's always been a big lifelong learner guy and really jumps into topics that not only he's interested in, but his kids are interested in, and it's a really cool thing. And Rick operates that way as well. From there, I wanted to jump into really why we were talking Evolution Talks, the book and his podcast series. If you haven't figured it out, I'm really into evolution. It's one of the books, or one of the topics I've read a ton of books about, and I get to go into it and ask him about his book in particular. Where I take this, where we start the journey, is actually where his book starts the journey. You'll touch a little bit on Darwin at the very beginning, as everyone does, but then he likes to take the journey, the actual start of the book, like chapter 1, post introduction, with a girl named Mary Anning. And I thought that was really cool because people can start their books about evolution in so many different spots. A lot of people do start with Darwin, a lot will start from single-celled organism, a lot will start with Sahara. I'd never seen anyone start in London, and I've never heard of Mary Anning before reading this book. So I thought that was a really cool thing, and I'll let him take it away from there.
Yeah, early, yeah, early
Really?
1800s. And what was and it's kind of cool that you mentioned that and you bring up that that's how you like how the book started. That was actually my agent's idea. And I
Really?
think I started the book with Aristotle, and I can't remember the conversation with her, but she mentioned it because I had done an episode on Mary Anning, and my agent thought, it would be great to start the book with that story and then weave it through, and it worked. It was one of those things that it was like an aha moment. As soon as she said it, I'm like, you know what, you're absolutely right. That would be the perfect way to start the book. So I can't take full credit for the putting that at the beginning, but it worked.
Let's dive deeper down the rabbit hole of the Mary Anning story. I thought it was very interesting, and it's something that I didn't know, despite the books that I've read, that this is really where the story of evolution took place.
So Mary Anning was at the time, at least at the beginning of the story, she was a little girl who lived in England. Um, she loved to comb the beaches around where she lived. So I just lost my camera there for a second. Hold on one moment. I'm going to bring you back. There we are.
No
So
worries.
anyway, she liked to go, and this was probably maybe 1811, 1812, and I'm not going to remember her exact age, but she was around 12, 14 years old. And her and her brother saw bones just sticking out of a cliff, and of course that interested them. They love to walk around and get shells and pick up shells and stuff, and that's kind of, there's a rumor that's that old nursery rhyme about I can't even say it, seashells by the seashore,
Yes.
that was based on Mary. But anyway, she found bones, and her dug the bones out, and it turned out to be an ichthyosaur, one of the first full skeletons of an ichthyosaur that was ever found. And there was a lot of excitement over that. and the excitement kind of fueled her passion for looking for more. And she did. She would go to the cliffs, go to the beach. She had an eye for it. She could spot things that other people couldn't. She'd see a piece of stone jutting out of the cliff, and she would see it as a bone, where anybody else like me, I might just see a rock sticking out of the side of a cliff. But she would see a bone, and she'd extract it, and she was meticulous about it. And she was, again, she was just a young girl, soon to be a young woman, and digging bones out of the cliff. And she became really famous at it. And her family they weren't well off, but they were able to sell some of the bones. And they would set up like a little shop. And I forget what the name of the shop was, to be honest, but set up a little shop, probably at their house, to sell some of the things that Mary had found and her brother had found. And they became so famous, and she became so famous for it, that other paleontologists of the time, like Richard Owen, which was a famous paleontologist, he's actually the one that came up with the term dinosaur. He went to visit, Mary, and she showed him around and stuff. So, yeah, it was a really cool story, and there were things that she was taking out of the cliffs that no one had seen before, and that was kind of why it was the perfect way to start the book, because people at that time, the term dinosaur didn't exist then. There were creatures that came before that no one had ever seen. And as these bones were revealed, people began to look at them and get excited about it, especially in England, where the first ones were all being found. It became an exciting time because people started thinking, how old is the Earth actually? And what came before us? What kind of creatures were on the Earth? And then 50 some odd years later, the first Neanderthal bones were found, and also in that area, but it was in Germany, the Neander Valley. So anytime, that was a huge time for discovery, and a huge time for people questioning our place and how old is the world, and how did the other creatures, how did we get here? And then of course Charles Darwin's book in 1859, the one that changed everything and explained everything, it was a part of that excitement. And it hasn't stopped. It's still something, there's so much we don't know, but we've learned so much in the last 170 years since Charles Darwin's book.
From there, I reflect a lot on how this was basically the big bang for humanity really diving in and discovering our origins. And that before this Mary Anning character came into, looking for seashells and finding bones, we had always gone with creationism. And kind of the story of Evolution Talks, the book itself, what separates it from other evolution books that I'd read, was that it's really the story of our study versus just the story of us. I thought that was very cool.
Yeah, it's just gonna say thank you for that, because that was one of that's always been probably the part of even doing the podcasts. The part that interests me the most is the history behind it all. I mean, obviously, evolution by natural selection interests me because of how powerful that is and how simple the concept is. I mean, it's so simple that when Charles Darwin came up with it and wrote his book, the people that got it and the people that accepted it were like, why didn't I think of that? It's such an easy concept. But the funny thing is as simple as a concept as it is to grasp, once you do grasp how it all works, is the fact that before Charles Darwin, for hundreds of years, not just decades, hundreds of years, there were other thinkers that were close. There were little, like almost like breadcrumbs that led all the way to Charles Darwin. Even his grandfather was kind of close. Yeah. That's what always interests me, is the history behind it. So even today, I'll still do episodes of the show that do go back to pre-Darwinian thinking and some of those early thinkers, because I just love the history behind it, and especially the fact that there were people, like even going back to Aristotle, they would touch upon it without actually nailing it, but they would touch upon it. There was so many times that people came close to getting it, and there was some that actually did get it before Charles Darwin did. Patrick Matthews comes immediately to mind. He was a writer around this. He was an arborist, I believe. Anyway, he wrote this extremely boring book before Darwin, and his book was about trees in the forest and culling trees to make way for other trees, and sturdier trees. And it was for naval timber. And that's what it was. It was naval timber. So the book was all about naval timber. But there was a piece of the book, an appendix in the book, where he actually came out and talks about natural selection without naming it. He actually got it, and nobody realized that. And even Darwin admitted, I never read that, but yes, Patrick. I mean, he had admittedly said Patrick Matthews got it too. So those kind of things interest me. Yes, those little stories in history that no one would ever know unless you happen to read the book Evolution Talk. You might never learn about it. But those little tidbits, those little stories that almost like human interest stories. I would never have known about Patrick Matthew and what he had discovered, and his little life, and the book that everyone thought was a ridiculously boring book, but hidden in those pages is the evolution by natural selection.
So I go on to talk about the different characters throughout his book. I say characters, but real people throughout his book that had these thoughts before Darwin and were just terrified of what could happen to their career or their family if they shared them. So what they would do is write fiction books and have the main character get into conversations about human origins. And if they ever got accused of anything, they're going to say, yeah, no, that character's crazy. And, like, that's not my thoughts. It's just a random fake person. And it's something that Rick does really well is that he really is so knowledgeable about all the players in the evolution story, not just the big names that you and I may know. It's really impressive. I highly recommend checking out his channel and his podcast and the book if you are interested in this episode. It's really, really cool. And he kind of cuts me off. I'm happy to have him do it and starts going into what he says here.
Yeah, yeah. And there were a lot of those. And his the one you're referencing, de Maillet, he wrote a book called The Teleomed, and which was actually his name backwards. But he was, just as you said, he was afraid of people knowing what he was thinking about, but he figured, well, yeah, I'll just fictionalize it, and then I can't get in trouble. It's just fiction. And he wasn't the only one that did that. Dennis Diderot did the exact same thing, and he's also mentioned in the book. And he was a famous writer at the time, very influential. Liked to hang out with philosophers and such. And back in the was this early 19th century, late 18th century. But anyway, so Diderot did the same thing. He started to question where we came from, and did animals evolve into man and such. So he did his stuff as fiction. And at the time, if you were writing things that went against the church, you could end up in jail. And Diderot did end up in jail for some of his writings. But he would try to couch his views in fiction and kind of arguments between the characters in his fictionalized tales, so that he wouldn't get in trouble. And there were others that did the same thing. Robert Chambers is another great one. Another story I love. Robert Chambers in the early 1800s wrote a book that touched on evolution. It wasn't a fictionalized account, but he really touched on evolution. But he published it anonymously, so nobody would know who did the book. And it didn't come out till he was long dead that he was the author, the true author of that book. And even Darwin references that book in his own. That was a book that he had read. And I think even to that point, Darwin wrote his book or published his book in 1859, and there were a lot of reasons why he published it when he did. But one of the reasons it took so long for him to publish it is because he saw what happened with Robert Chambers' book. People were like, you're probably grabbing pitchforks and running through the streets, like, who wrote this book? Ready to, hang the author. So Darwin would see these things, and I'm sure it made him nervous. So he wanted to make sure his theory was airtight before he, kind of published it and led on. He only talked to close friends about it up until the time he published it. And he was almost forced into publishing it in 1859, just because of reasons. And we can get into that if you want to later. But yeah, so you're absolutely right. There were a lot of early thinkers that were afraid of how their theories, their thoughts, their ideas would be received. So they either fictionalized it, published anonymously, or I'm sure there were a lot that we don't even know of, that they probably wrote these wonderful books about evolution, maybe even by natural selection, and just never published them. Some of them, we'll just never know.
Yeah.
There's so many books that were probably lost to history because people were afraid to let their views be known.
I start talking about the parallels between the evolutionary authors pre-Darwin and how they're afraid of this crucifixion of the mob, and seeing the similarities to our times now, maybe not necessarily with evolution itself, but political pockets in America, and I'm sure all around the world, you can't say certain things. It's blasphemy, it's heretics, and how human nature hasn't actually changed. This is weird parallel, and a good book on that is actually The Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Eric Heist. And it's crazy as you hear these stories Rick tells, you just see the same type of mindset and just human nature from the 1600s all the way through our present time.
I find it amazing all the time reading something that might be 2 or 3 centuries old and seeing the same fears, the same desires, the same everything reflected in those words that are, centuries old. As we think the same way. It's things like, to your point, things haven't changed. We're still people. We still love and dream and die, and we have all the anxieties that they had 200 or 300 years ago, just different. Maybe different causes or different reasons for some of those fears and anxieties, but the way people are really hasn't changed.
From there, I kind of turned the conversation to a later on point in the book where Rick is having a dinner party with friends, and one of the women there, just says it's not real, evolution's not real, and it's just a theory, and all this stuff that I'm sure if you are interested in evolution, you've heard it before. And it reminded me of a story from my childhood when I first heard about evolution, the concept of it, it just said, yep, that makes sense. Like, that's obviously how it works. Natural selection made sense. And I just kind of went on with my day until later on in my, let's say, late teenage years. One of my friends just didn't believe in it. A good friend of mine didn't believe in it. And we just had this argument. And it sparked this thing in me. I was like, okay, I need to know what I'm talking about. So I watched it on YouTube, started reading about it more. And as I got older, I became more and more of a reader versus YouTube. And I really wanted to get his insight on how you go about those conversations. I thought it was a really cool part of the book where, he brings himself into it and his own journey and story into it, which in a lot of evolution books is not the case. A lot of authors do that, but not so in evolution books. So from there, I kind of asked, hey, how do you handle that situation?
That's a really good question too, because that's something I struggle with. You brought up the dinner party, but there are other instances. The one that always comes to mind talking about it is when my son was young and he played football. He was just a little kid, and we go to watch his football games and watch his practices. And the practices were kind of boring, so I'd bring a book to read. Set up a chair, and one of the books happened at the time. It was a Richard Dawkins book. Might have been The Greatest Show on Earth. It was one of Richard Dawkins' more popular evolution books. So I'm sitting back reading the book, and one of the mothers of another player walked by, and she happened to see what I was reading, and she was like, and she made a comment. She goes, "You should read the Bible instead," and just kept on walking. And I didn't know what to say, and I wasn't going to argue at that point, try to convince anybody. But if somebody, you can kind of tell if somebody's interested in having a conversation, that's wonderful. If they're not, I don't even bother. I don't even try. I'm not trying to convert anybody's thoughts.
Yeah.
I want to teach folks or help people who are interested understand how the theory works, and that's my main goal. If somebody wants to understand, I'm there, and I'll talk all day about it. But there are a lot of times where I've talked to somebody who maybe doesn't quite believe it, but at least wants to have the conversation. And I always will I'd like to start with Darwin. And I don't do it in a boring way and just talk about Darwin's life or anything, but I usually start with Darwin himself was troubled by his own theory. It wasn't something he came up with and was like, I'm going to prove to the world that creationism is wrong. And it wasn't something that he was out to be combative about. He wanted to understand how it all worked. And when he began to understand, I mean, he was also, at one time, he wanted to be a priest, not a priest, but what do you call it? A pastor, English pastor, and wanted to live a quiet life. So I mean, he believed in God and the teachings of the church until he started to realize that there was another. It happened differently, and that bothered him. So I usually will start with saying, Darwin himself was troubled by his own theory, but that the theory itself is real simple. And I like to just I always try to use analogies, or I'll talk like one of the episodes that gets brought up a lot, actually, when I talk to people, or people will send me an email and they'll mention the episode on natural selection, and I use the concept of like blue frogs and red frogs, and I think that one I was talking more about genetic drift. But I like to simplify and walk somebody through how two examples of the same species can be separated by something. Who cares why they're separated, but somehow they're separated, never to meet again. And during their separation, they go through changes. The mutations. Different things change that, if they're beneficial to their survival and it helps them adapt in whatever environment they found themselves in, those changes will persist and they'll pass them down to their children if it's a heritable change. Some changes aren't heritable, but if it's a mutation to a gene that their offspring can inherit, their offspring will carry that on. And the longer those two initial animals that separated, the longer they're apart, someday, if they ever encounter each other again, they could look completely different. And I could walk outside this afternoon. I was reading outside during lunch, and chipmunk ran by. But we're related. It just took a billion years for us to evolve into the shapes and sizes and what we are. I mean, there was one time we do have a common ancestor, that chipmunk that ran by me. It's just evolution. It's just we adapted differently, and it's a big world, and animals move on and they change and they adapt. And it all started with the way Erasmus Darwin put it. Charles's grandfather was, we all started with one little filament, and he's right. We started with one little, he called it a filament, but with us it was one little cell that just evolved and split, and those cells went different ways, and they kept evolving and splitting, and then we have this. I mean, I didn't do a good job explaining it right now because I know we only have limited time here, but the point is, to your question, going back to your question, if somebody's willing to talk about it, I'll talk about it all day, and I'll take as much time as answer as many questions as they have, about the topic. But if somebody's antagonistic or they're not interested and they just want to argue about it, I'm usually not interested in those conversations.
So from there, I really disagree. I bring up a couple of debates from my past where it had been a long time since I have found myself yelling. I'd say early college, but I still love discussions. I have a podcast, for God's sake. I love discussions, and I do find myself having conversations while I'm sitting there smiling. And if it's a topic like this or a political topic, the other person, I start to see the temperature rise. At times, it may even get kind of into a yelling, loud talking situation. I'm sitting there with a smile on my face, and that doesn't help the situation. It ruins their day. It ruins my day because now I have to sit here and think about that. And it's been a process of trial and error for me. And it's just nice to hear a seasoned, smart adult to, bounce those thoughts off of. From there, I bring up another book, though. The Ape That Understood the Universe, another evolution book that I really enjoyed. And specifically, I bring up analogy and mnemonics. If you are a listener, you've probably heard me bring up memes and the study of memes, mnemonics, before as they're moving units of culture. But what I really wanted to focus on there was the analogy piece of it. And how, for some reason, it's one of the primary ways we learn as humans are through analogy and metaphor. And Rick, in his book, Evolution Talks, he has a really good analogy using red frogs and blue frogs, and he uses it in a variety of ways. It's really, really cool. It's a very good concept, and I have him jump into a couple of those analogies he uses to explain natural selection versus a natural disaster, what all can cause the variation within these frogs, and obviously as an overall analogy for evolution.
Yeah, yeah, and I think actually I was probably talking more about genetic drift at the time, but it all still kind of fits. But I actually was talking about genetic drift, but I'll first touch on that, and then I'll talk about the other piece of the analogy. But with in this instance, and you can use anything, but I like to use the red and blue frogs. So you could have say you have two groups of frogs that evolve, one with a red pigment, one with a blue pigment, living happily in this forest. And then along comes a wolf who's hungry for blue frogs. For some reason, this wolf loves blue frogs. So that's obviously you're going to see the population of blue frogs decrease because of the fact that the wolf is there. What I like to do is take that analogy even further to talk about how natural selection comes into play. So that's genetic drift. That's when you have, you'll see a decrease in the population, and that's because of, a fire could sweep through and kill, for just random chance happens to kill all of the red frogs. That's not evolution by natural selection. They're just unhappy circumstance where a fire just wiped them all out. So you might come walking in as a scientist or somebody, look around and see, wow, there's a lot of blue frogs here, less of the red frogs. There must be something in the environment, or they an adaptive force favored the blue frogs. But no, it's just a fire that came through. But you can, what I like to do with the same analogy, and you can use whatever you want, but you could separate those two frogs. You could have the blue frogs go over here and the red frogs over here, and for some reason, maybe there was a fire and it put this big line of burnt trees down the middle of the forest, so the red ones and the blue ones never mix again. There could be, say, the blue frogs, again, bring that wolf around. Blue frogs are being eaten by the wolf because the wolf likes blue frogs. A genetic mutation could come along that maybe makes one of the offspring, a little bit smaller. I'm simplifying this, but makes one blue frog a little bit smaller. That frog, because it's smaller, is able to kind of crawl under a root of a tree where the others can't. So because that frog can do so, it has an advantage. It's going to live a little bit longer, hopefully. If all things, being good to that little blue frog, it'll live long enough to have offspring, and hopefully that their offspring will also be they'll inherit that small gene and be a little bit smaller frogs, while the bigger blue frogs are still being eaten by the wolf. So over time, that blue frog population is now made up of small ones because they can hide from the wolf. There could be other different adaptations they go through, but then you bring that red frog and blue frog back together. Red frog might have evolved differently, but the blue frog's going to be a lot smaller. And that's where evolution by natural selection comes in. There's still species of frog, but give it another billion years and more changes can happen, completely change them. But I always do like to use that analogy when explaining different aspects of it, because I can use the same forest, the same populations of blue and red frogs, and talk about different parts like genetic drift, talk about natural selection, talk about altruism, talk about whatever it is. I can fit it into that population. And it makes it simple. It makes it easier for me to explain it. And the more I do it, the more I can add to it. But hopefully I answered your question. But
yeah, it's a brilliant way of answering. I have him go down a road of natural selection versus sexual selection, and the debate that actually came up between those. Are they separate? Are they combined? Is one a branch of the other? And Rick goes into his studies and his findings about this.
Yeah, absolutely. So with sexual, and you raised the point of the peacock and such, and Charles Darwin, I mean, the peacock always bothered him. I mean, he was like, yeah, it didn't make sense to him because the peacock has this big giant plumage, beautiful plumage, and it just attracts predators. So to Charles Darwin, it's like, yeah, what kind of advantage is that to have adapted and evolved to have this, to make yourself more noticeable to anything that wants to eat you? So he didn't quite get it. So what he eventually there came the idea of sexual selection, and where that would come into play is, yeah, okay, so they have this beautiful plumage, but perhaps it's because it attracts the opposite sex. There's something in that plumage, something in maybe the color, something in how big it is, but it attracts the opposite sex. So that's an advantage, because the whole point of life and natural selection is you need to live long enough to have offspring, and your offspring inherit those genes. So if you're attracting more mates because of this big plumage, then your offspring are going to also do the same thing. So that was described as sexual selection, because it's all driven by sex, and a lot of other things. Other examples in the animal kingdom driven by sex, because you're attracting the opposite sex, attracting a mate, and having offspring. But there are, they would disagree about that, and there were other naturalists who disagreed and didn't believe in it and said, sexual selection can't be a thing. But to me, it really is just natural selection. It's still nature. It's not. There's nothing unnatural about sexual selection. It's still all natural selection. It's nature. It's adaptability. It's mutations. It's change, and it's having offspring and evolving. And it's all, to me, it's all the same umbrella. So there's really nothing to argue about. You might want to try to understand the nuances, and you might come close, and you might be completely wrong. There's no way to really know. Even with intense studies, sometimes it's hard to explain how certain things work in nature. We don't even understand our own consciousness, and we probably never will. We might be incapable of understanding how our brains can give rise to consciousness. So anyway, to me, the argument, I get the argument, but it's all natural selection to me. You can still explain it in natural selection terms and leave out the whole sexual selection piece. Although, okay, that's part of it, but it still fits into the umbrella of natural selection.
So from there, I kind of steer the conversation towards altruism as part of the discussions that I've had with people that question evolution have usually ended up going into altruism, and a lot of the books you read will talk about altruism in human beings, how it seems to contradict the whole theory of evolution. And I bring up a story that was actually in one of the books that I read, a true story, where a car was underwater and it was getting submerged with water. Obviously, the people inside were drowning or going to drown. And there's an older brother around 10, a younger brother around 6, who were in the car. A diver comes to save them. Before this car is filled up with water, the older brother, who the diver's grabbing, says, "No, don't save me. Go get my brother." The diver grabs the little brother and goes back for the older brother. The older brother didn't make it. There's other examples of altruism, and you can see it on social media at times. We love it. If we see this happens, it gets a ton of likes. There's true examples of altruism. So there are people pro-evolution who would say, well, altruism doesn't exist. And at that point, I'd kind of join the other team for a second and say, well, of course it does. We've seen it. And I asked Rick, how does that come about? Is it part of group selection? Or in your opinion, how did this evolve inside of humans, this altruism thing?
That's one of the toughest ones to wrap your head around. And you have to, at least for me, I had a hard time understanding how altruism could even work as well, because like your example is a perfect one. Or somebody or even the person that jumped in the water to save the child that he was able to save, or she was able to save. There's altruism right there. I mean, diving into the water, putting yourself at risk to save somebody else. So where's the advantage to that? If everybody did that, we probably wouldn't. You could make the argument we wouldn't survive as a species if everyone was always sticking their neck out for someone else. But it exists. We know it does. We see it. We see it in the animal kingdom. I mean, it's not just humans that do exhibit altruistic behavior. Rats exhibit altruistic behavior with their young and family members and such. So where does that come from? Where's the advantage of that? But it does. You mentioned group selection, and I think that has a lot to do with it. And to understand it, or to try to understand it, at least for me, is I have to put it in it's not something that you just evolved overnight. You have to look at it in the amount of time that it probably took to evolve that altruistic gene, that altruistic trait. And so if a group, looking at it as a group, and a lot of evolutionary biologists disagree over this group selection and such, but if you have a group of organisms that look out for one another, that group will obviously survive longer than a group that just doesn't look out for one another. You could have the same, using our red and blue frogs again, you could have blue frogs that look out for one another and help each other, and then the other group of frogs, they don't care. They just care about themselves. One group is going to fare a lot better in certain environments than the other one. And I think over time that, whether it be a genetic mutation, whatever the case may be, there's something in them that when another of the like species, whether it be their children, a family member, or maybe just a stranger of the same species, is in trouble, their first thought is to help them. They don't know why. The guy or the woman who jumped in the water might not have, they didn't have time to think. They didn't just look down and think, should I do this? Should I not do this? It was just bang. There's something that drove them to do that. And another example in the animal species is a squirrel. If there's a hawk around, a squirrel, certain species of squirrels, I guess, will call out. They're attracting danger. As soon as they call out, that hawk, boom, there you are. But they're doing it to warn the others. So it's I don't think you can escape group selection when trying to understand altruism. I think it had to have started, what benefited the group. And if that group was able to evolve to exhibit these altruistic behaviors, then that group fares well. And I think that's, and not to go off on a whole nother tangent, but with all the talk about artificial intelligence, that's what we're going to need. And I won't get into this now because it's a little bit self-promotion, but my second book's all about artificial intelligence. And
I would love to get into it now.
I'd
love to get into it now. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, actually, which I was thinking towards the end, but amazingly, we're already 50 minutes in. It feels like we're 10 minutes in. But I really wanted to ask you, hey, so where do you think the next stages of evolution are going? I actually just had a conversation on a plane ride with a woman that I met, and that, I don't know how it came up. We just ended up talking throughout the flight, and she was talking about how evolution is, all this stuff, and how, eventually it's just going to be robots, and that's okay because it's just the next stage of evolution. Like at one point it was cells to this, to that, to us, and that's what it's going to be. And it's still life, and it's whatever. And she had a good argument and a good point to make me feel good about it. But at the same time, a human being, I want to see the human race win, and if not the human race, I want to see organic life win. So I'd love to hear about your book. Actually, I'd love to hear about your thoughts on AI and its role in evolution, and what you think the future might look like all of it. I'd love to go down that hole as well.
Yeah. I won't talk too much about it because I know we're talking about evolution stuff, but it does tie together, and that's why I've turned my focus on AI and such for my next book. And the book takes a lot of the same playbook, talks about the past, talks about the prior thinkers, going back to automatons. We always, as a species, like to try to create things in our own image. Been doing that, creating dolls and clockmakers who come out of the little mechanical clockmakers or hit the bell and stuff. So anyways, going back to what you're saying, I think that's absolutely it. I think that artificial intelligence, or artificial general intelligence, AGI, it will happen. I don't know that it's going to happen now. We're not there yet. It could happen 10 years from now. It could happen tomorrow. We could find out tomorrow. It's going to happen eventually. What happens when it does is anybody's guess. And obviously, we both hear all the fears and all the doomsayers and everything. They're going to kill us, and we've got to watch out for it. I tend to I'm not. I don't see it as being the threat that everyone else does. But still, I do think we need to take precautions. And that's when we were talking about altruism. One of the things I do in the book, which I had a lot of fun with, to be honest with you, because there's a lot of I get to get very speculative in the book. And I was like, one of the things, Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. Are you familiar with those?
I am not actually.
Yeah. So I won't get into all that, but one of the things I came up with is an altruistic gene. That's one piece of code we should put in AI as an altruistic gene. And I kind of walk it through how that code could look. I used to be a coder too, not a great one by any means, but at least I understand the basics of code, and I could write code. So I just kind of like, in a very completely high level, said this is what an altruistic gene would look like. And if you can put this in AI, and AI develops with it. Anyway, going back to your question, I do think that could be our next step of evolution. And I even name it in the book Homo artificiensis, artificial. So
Yeah.
I mean that's could conceivably be the next step in human evolution. Still using the genus Homo, and bringing it forward into artificial intelligence that thinks like us. And how can it not? It's going to think like us to some extent. It's going to evolve differently because it's going to play around with its own code at some point. It's going to muck around with its own code and change its own code. It's going to do things we can't even imagine. But at first, it's still going to think like us. It can't not. That's how it's being designed. But it will change, and it could change like that. It could think like us for a week and then be completely different. So we
Yeah.
can't. There's no way to get around it. So no matter how you look at it, it is theoretically the next step in our evolution. And people too, I mean, it could turn into cyborgs. People are already adding prosthetic limbs. Elon Musk is talking about the chip in the head, and being able to control things with your mind, and having an interface, a cognitive interface between the brain and prosthetics or computers or whatever the case may be. That's still a step in evolution, and it's still natural selection. There's nothing unnatural about doing that. So I really do believe that unless a solar flare hits us tomorrow and wipes out all electrics, and there goes AI and everything else, that could conceivably be our next step in evolution. Yeah.
I thought that was a super cool thing. I wanted to jump into it. I actually wanted to ask originally about AI at the end of the conversation. And what a perfect segue into this, because for me, there's a couple ways of looking at it. One, AI and robots and inorganic life is just the next stage of evolution. And as we started as cells and made it to the land, and all of these things happened, that's just the next stage. Now, on the other side, and more so what I hope, is that obviously the human race is this race that lives forever. And however that may look, hopefully it's still a piece of us, Homo something, if not Homo sapien. And if not us, I'd like it to be organic life. And I talk about how I would like to put some, if I had some money to bet, I'd put some money on mushrooms in a million years if we don't make it. That, it's not a plant. We have more DNA in common with mushrooms and mushrooms do with plants. And if you bite into a portobello mushroom, it's more of a meat than it is a plant. And so if not us, maybe something like that. Maybe, who knows, dolphins, whales, cats, whatever it may be. And I was curious to see his opinions on it. And since he's writing a book about it, how does this tie into evolution?
We're eventually going to be gone anyway. I mean, just in the the history of this world, there's been many different hominin species. We're just the ones that happen to be standing today. But there was a point maybe 50,000 years ago where there were more than just us. You had the Neanderthals, Homo neanderthal. They were there. They were here the same time we were. Floresiensis and Flores, they lived the same time we did. we weren't the only Homo species, the only hominin species in the world at one particular time. We're just the ones that happen to be here now. But our time is not going to be forever. We'll evolve into, if say AI never happens, take AI out of the equation, we'll evolve into something else that doesn't resemble Homo sapiens of today. It'll be slow. It's not going to be fast as
Of
that's
course.
how evolution works. But a billion years from now, could be completely unrecognizable, could resemble the gray aliens that you see pictures of with the big eyes and the big head and stuff. Who knows? So many adaptive changes. But we could also go to another planet. We'll eventually probably colonize Mars. There's a perfect separation there for two species that started out the same to completely change. Yeah, if you know, because it's not like we're next door and we can just make the trip back and forth unless we come up with some other means of travel. So there's so many, and again, we're speculating, but Homo sapiens will evolve into something else. Could evolve into different species of Homo at some point if we do colonize other planets and so on and so forth, or we disappear and the next thing to carry on what we started is Homo artificiensis, and it's all AI.
So from there, I wanted to hear more about the Homo sapien race. Are we gonna make it? I asked him if he had money to put down, and he was playing that mental exercise game of if not us, who? Let's say it's gonna be organic life. Not us, who? Who are you putting money down on?
Yeah, if I had to, if I taking taking a cue from you, if I had a bunch of chips, I'd throw it on octopus.
Octopus.
Yeah, yeah, I think they're incredibly smart, incredibly smart creatures, and they if it's not us a million years from now, a billion years from now, whatever, I could see it being them. And
I
they
see that too.
unfortunately have a very short life, but the things that they can do in their very short life is amazing. Give them a longer life somehow, hopefully they evolve a longer lifespan. I can see them doing incredible things. Their life is too short right now.
How long do they usually live?
I want to say 3 years. They don't live very
Oh,
long.
incredibly
Yeah. And
short.
I just read a book about, actually a couple brilliant books about them recently, and it's a short period of time. I think 3 years might be a long time for an octopus to live, and that's in captivity. In the wild, it's you probably cut that in half because they have a lot of predators they have to face.
Yeah, yeah. They are an interesting creature. I don't know much about them, but I know that if their beak can fit through something, they can fit through. And that's
Oh yeah,
incredible to me. That's
oh,
actually
it's
insane.
incredible. The stuff. One of my favorite stories about an octopus, just to throw this out there, I love it. So it was I think it was actually at the Boston Aquarium, right an hour away from me, an hour and a half away from me. Anyway, so they kept noticing, the keepers of the aquarium kept noticing that there was something kept getting into a fish tank, and they didn't understand, what it was. It was just fish were disappearing from one of the tanks, and this is a true story. So one of the night watchmen one night, I don't know if he was changed his rounds, or I don't remember how this happened, or maybe it was even one of the aquarium workers happened to go in late at night. Whatever the case may be, they were going up the stairs, and coming down the stairs was an octopus going down to grab those fish, and they both just kind of stopped and looked at each other. So it's like the octopus was caught in the act, like, oh damn. So that's what the octopus was doing. It would unscrew how it got out of its tank. I guess it was a way it would unscrew
Wow.
whatever. It would go downstairs, raid the fish tank, sneak back upstairs, screw it all back so no one would ever know it left. It's in the middle of the night, and then someone had to catch it going down the stairs one time.
Wow.
And that's how smart those
That's
things
pretty
are.
incredible.
It
Yeah,
is.
imagine if those lived for 80 years. That is
Yeah,
wild.
just I think if you could just give them a longer lifespan and more time to do things, and maybe they'll get that chance someday. But I see them as being the kind of like the what is it, we pass the torch on to them.
The story of the octopus is wild. That's actually a wild story. It definitely convinced me to put a couple chips on the octopus. And I kind of talk about how it would be very cool if, obviously, we won't be able to, but if we were able to see the future, just what would happen. And I'd love to see what the next steps of evolution and the journey go. And I touch on, it is a blessing though to be in the time period that we are in. And it really is, to be able to have these conversations with anyone, anywhere in the world, and having our evolution come this far. It's just a huge blessing to be a part of. And then he kind of jumps in here.
And you can apply it to anything, not just biological, animals. You can apply it to how the universe formed. You can apply evolution, just evolution by natural selection. You can apply to everything. There's not one thing you can't apply it to. And that's what I found amazing about it. It's just, you can apply it to how your iPhone came into existence, market selection, but it's still natural selection.
Yeah.
And I don't know, that stuff always will amaze me.
Yeah, that's again, I can't remember which book it was, but one of the books I read about evolution, it brought up that point, and it used ships, used boats as this like example of, someone made a boat, and a bunch of them made a boat, but most of them drowned. A couple people didn't drown.
Right. Yeah.
And they took that boat and they said, okay, well, we'll start doing this, and then some of them got faster, some of them just were able to last longer, and then you fast forward to today, and we have these yachts or whatever, and they took it a bunch of different ways, but that was the main mechanism. That was the main analogy. Going back to analogies,
that was the power of analogy.
The main analogy,
and that's
it really is incredible.
That's a great one too. I like that one about the boats. That's a really good one. Yeah,
it is incredible. Very, and it's cool that it may make so many different points, honestly, but it's cool that like one of the ways it takes is that nobody wrote down, okay, I want a device that's going to allow me to float across the water. It wasn't a creationism idea. It wasn't like, okay, how do we best do this? It was, here's a piece of wood, go in the water.
Right. Yeah.
And the wood floats. So,
yeah.
And it was a step-by-step process. I really like that. It was a really, really good analogy. I'd love to go down a bunch of routes here, and I could talk to you for hours and learn about the stuff for hours, but I know we're on a little bit of a time crunch here, and there's a few questions I'd like to ask at the end. And actually, one of the questions I'm going to turn to two for you, because it's a question about, hey, what are any books you recommend, any paradigm shifters that you've come across that you've loved? And I would like to ask that about evolution, and then I'd like to ask a non-evolution one. It doesn't have to be one book, anything that comes to mind. So first, any evolution books that were big for you, that stand out for you? I take that, what he just said, and I use the analogy, let's use another analogy, of boats. That a boat, no one sat there and designed it. What happened was people discovered wood would float. So they started making rafts. And the ones that didn't sink, people designed them like that again. And tiny little modifications, which in our world would be called mutations, but tiny little modifications here and there, and all of a sudden these boats start to evolve. So it really can apply to anything, and that was the analogy that I used. From here, I just go into my closing questions, the first of which are about books, any big books, paradigm shifters, evolution, or otherwise for you.
Yeah, as far as evolution books, I'd probably have to say Richard Dawkins' Greatest Show on Earth is probably a great one for someone to pick up who's not familiar with the theory. He does a wonderful job. Yeah, I would say that, and I think that book came out 2010-ish. It's not too old. That would probably be the top evolution book I would recommend. As far as other books that were kind of like shifts in paradigm, I can't think of the title. Sean Carroll. It's a book about time. And hold on one second. It's called From Eternity to Here: The Quest for the Ultimate Theory of Time by physicist Sean Carroll. Incredible book. Talks about things like time travel. It talks about Einstein's theory, explains that. Really good book about time, and it makes you look at time in a whole different way.
I asked my outro question, which is, what is the meaning of life?
All right. If I had to nail down one thing to keep it short, the meaning of life is to be happy, to do
Yeah.
whatever it is that will make you happy is do that, whatever it is in life. Whether it's, listening to music, whether it's planting a garden, whatever those things are, don't worry about what everybody else is doing. I mean, that's the big thing. I think Thomas Edison, no, it wasn't Thomas Edison, it was Thomas Jefferson. One of my favorite things that he said, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, but he basically was, if it doesn't break my leg or pick my pocket, why should I worry about it? So, do whatever makes you happy. Don't worry about other folks. That doesn't matter. You've only got one life. You don't want to look back and think, I wish I had done this, but I didn't because of what people thought. To me, that's the
Great
meaning of
point.
life. But if I
I know
wanted to put it in evolutionary terms, it won't be so it won't be so pretty.
Yeah, no,
or poetic.
That wouldn't be as pretty. That was the bulk of the conversation. We put this together as best we could. I hope you enjoyed learning about it. Again, I highly recommend checking out the book or the podcast. It's really good. And if you're interested in evolution, he breaks it down in a way that's very digestible and more accessible than anyone else I've read, to be honest. So again, Rick, thank you for the conversation. I hope that this is something that, it's salvageable. We're really trying to make this one work and get it up there. Everyone else, thank you for listening. I appreciate you joining the journey with me. And I hope that you enjoy this guest and the guests we still have to come.